Is the design sprint still relevant today in 2025 and beyond? In this video, I'll break it down for you based on my recent experiences using this methodology. Hi guys, if you don't know me, my name is Alvin. I come from Relab. We're an advisory firm here in Melbourne, Australia. We focus on the design sprint, the design thinking processes, particularly around digital products. Now, I've done a lot of design sprints in the last 5 to 8 years. There's a lot of experiences that I wanted to share with you, but in this video, I'd like to break down the essential things that a lot of people have been asking me in terms of how you use the design sprint today. And therefore, I'd like to jump into this digital paper of mine so I can take you through my thinking. The design sprint is based on the design thinking as a process. So if we look at the design thinking, essentially there are steps around understanding the problem. There's understand, there's define, there's ideate, there's decide. Now, these are just general steps of the design thinking. There might be different versions of it, but for the purposes of this, I'll go with this one. And then the next one down here is prototype and validate. So if we talk about the design sprint itself, it's still based on these steps or these phases of a project, except it's a lot more compact. Using the tools of design thinking, we can go into design sprint knowing that we have a target, we have a purpose, and we're going to do it in the leanest way without compromising the quality of the work. Okay, we'll have a look at the different activities that falls under understand, define, ideate, decide, prototype, and validate. Understand are things that enable you and the teams to understand the current state of the problem, maybe align the vision of the company. So these are things like goals, stakeholder interviews, even lightning demo is part of this. It's basically activities that allow stakeholders to align their vision, align their thinking, align their expectation. Define is when you start looking into the solution to what the business wants. And these are potentially activities like journey mapping, prioritization, and so on and so forth, right? I'm not going to dive too deep into the different activities here. Ideate are things like, sketching, storyboarding, and so on and so forth. That allows decision makers and stakeholders and teams to decide, for example, voting. The Silent Art Museum is part of this. Right? Speed critique. There are all sorts of tools that you could use out there to decide on an idea or a winning solution. And from there, you prototype, obviously. For example, clickable mock, flows, and whatnot. And validate are things like user interviews, as an example. Right? So if you look at all of these different activities in a fullness of form, they can form into a full design sprint process. So if we trace back to how design sprint was popularized by Jake Knapp and the Sprint book, and a lot of us in the ecosystem have started implementing it and then coming up with our own versions of it, from a 3-day version, a 4-day version, a 5-day version, and we do have quite a few different videos around this. We'll make sure we link it for you. Please have a look at that for some context. Today, I would say that it's not strictly X number of day in terms of design sprint, because we run design sprints that are 5 days, 3 days, sometimes it's 2 weeks program, 4 weeks program, depending on the case. So how do we break this down and know what the best version of the design sprint to use? It's really just trying to understand the different types of steps that we have here, from understand, define, ideate, decide, prototype, validate, and match it with the case that you're dealing with. As an example, there might be cases or projects that does not require validation for whatever reason. right? There might be some cases where a project does not require the understand bit, but rather you jump into ideate and decide. So essentially what I would do is look at it in stages. There's obviously the pre-flight. There is the sprint itself, which can be defined into so many different forms. And there's the post-flight. So the pre-flight is a mandatory one, and this normally will take 1 to 2 hours of activity plus a pre-flight period, which may be a week or 2 weeks depending on how long it takes for the team to gather resources as well as information that is required before you start the sprint. Now, sprint can be defined as, is it a 1 week sprint? Is there like 1 sprint or 2 sprints in there? But let's just say there's a 1 week. And what's within that 1 week? There's 5 days. And this 5 days is really flexible depending on what goal you need to achieve at the end. If you really need a prototype that is user validated, then you'll have to go through the understand, define, ideate, decide, prototype, and validate. You might do day 1 as understand and define. Day 2 is ideate and decide. And then you spend day 3 and 4 as prototype, and then day 5 as validate. You might even decide to do validate in a whole new sprint itself, that your 2 week or your second week is validate, and you spend only 3 days in there. Why is that so? Because that's the amount of budget or resources that you have on hand. You can also say do validate instead of 3. You decide, okay, we're going to do validate, but spend only 2 days. And then in the third day, day 3 of the second week, I'm going to run a iteration of prototype. Iterate prototype. So all you need to understand is really the process that leads from one thing to another. In order to be able to define and ideate, you need to first understand. And in order to be able to prototype, you need to decide collectively and prototype with intent in order for you to be able to validate efficiently. So coming back to the point here, is the design sprint still relevant today? Absolutely, even more so. The art that you need to master when facilitating a design sprint is really knowing the tools that you have within the design sprint, design thinking toolbox, and know which one is the most effective, the leanest thing to use without having to spend too much time, but it still takes you to the next phase that allows you to test against real users, and therefore anchored by the principles, you're able to run this process that is human-centered, drives focus to what matters the most, which is your user or customers, in order to inform business decisions and be able to prioritize on the next steps systematically. Essentially, I think that's what Design Sprint has been so helpful on, at least with all of the clients that I deal with and all of the cases that I've been helping them with. All right, we'll leave it there. Do ask me if you have any questions. Or if you're thinking of running a design sprint yourself within your business, within the company that you are leading, please reach out to me, because there are so many different ways as to how you could attack this. But with my experience and all of the cases that I've seen before, chances are I'll be able to provide you some guidance on the best design sprint format or structure that is suited for your challenge, your company, your case. All right, I hope to chat to you soon. Otherwise, have a good day and stay well.